Chapter 12. In the Tarns Nest. My wrists and ankles were bound to a hollow floating frame. The rope sawed into my flesh as the weight of my body drew upon them. I turned my head, sick to my stomach, and threw up into the turbid waters of the vosque. I blinked my eyes against that hot sun, trying to move my wrists and ankles. A voice spoke. "He's awake." Dimly I felt spear butts thrust against the side of the hollow frame, ready to edge it out into the current. I cleared my head as best I could, and into my uncertain field of vision moved a dark object, which became the black helmet of a member of the caste of assassins. Slowly, with a stylized movement, the helmet was lifted, and I found myself staring up into a gray, lean, cruel face, a face that might have been made of metal. The eyes were inscrutable, as if they had been made of glass or stone, and set artificially in that metallic mask of a countenance. "I am Parkour," said the man. It was he, the master assassin of Ar, leader of the assembled horde. "We meet again," I said. His eyes, like glass or stone, revealed nothing. "The cylinder at Korovar," I said. "The crossbow." He said nothing. "You failed to kill me that time," I taunted. "Perhaps you would care to risk another shot now? Perhaps this mark would be more suited to your skills." The men behind Parkour muttered at my impudence. He himself showed no impatience. "My weapon," he said, simply extending his hand. A crossbow immediately placed in his grip. It was a large steel bow, wound and set, the iron quarrel placed in the guide. I prepared to welcome the bolt flashing through my body. I was curious to know if I would be conscious of its strike. Parkour raised his hand with an imperious gesture, and from somewhere I saw a small, round object sailing high into the air, out over the whisper. It was a single Tarn disc, hurled by one of Parkour's men. Just as the tiny object, black against the blue sky, reached its apogee, I heard the click of the trigger, the vibration of the string, and the swift hiss of the quarrel. Before the Tarn disc could even begin its fall, the quarrel pierced it, carrying it, I would judge, some 250 yards out into the river. The men of Parkour stamped their feet to the sand, clinging their spears upon their shields. "I mayhap spoke as a fool," I said to Parkour. "And you will die the death of a fool," he said. He spoke with no trace of anger, no emotion of any kind. He motioned to the men to thrust the frame out farther into the river, where it should be swept away. "Wait," I said. "I ask a favor." The words came hard, but Parkour gestured to his men to desist. "What have you done with the girl?" "She is Talina, daughter of the Ubar Marlinus," said Parkour. "She will rule in Ar as my queen." "She would die first," I said. "She has accepted me," said Parkour, "and will rule by my side." The stone eyes regarded me, expressionless. "It was by her wish that you would die this death of a villain," he said, "upon the frame of humiliation unworthy to stain our weapons. I closed my eyes. I should have known that the proud Talina, daughter of an Ubar, would leap at the first chance to return to power in Ar, even though it be the head of a plundering host of brigands. I, her protector, was now to be discarded. Indeed, this frame of humiliation would be ample vengeance to satisfy even Talina for the indignities that she had suffered upon my hands. It, if anything, would wipe out forever from her mind the offensive memory that she had once needed my help and that she had pretended to love me. Then each of the men of parkour, as is the custom before a frame is surrendered to the waters of the vosque, spit upon my body. Lastly, parkour spit upon his hand, and placed his hand upon my chest. "Were it not for the daughter of Marlinus," said parkour, his metallic face as placid as the quicksilver behind a mirror, "I would have slain you honorably. That I swear by the black helmet of my caste." "I believe you." My voice choked, no longer caring if I lived or died. The spear butts pressed against the frame, shoving it out and away from the bank. The current soon caught it, and began to spin in slow circles farther and farther into the midst of the vast force of nature called the vosque. This death would not be a pleasant one. Bound helplessly without food or water, my own body would torture me by its weight, dragging upon the hand and ankle ropes, suspended just a few inches above the roiling muddy surface under the fiery sun. I knew that I would not, some days hence, reach the delta of the vosque and the cities in the delta, except perhaps as a bound corpse, withered by exposure and lack of water. Indeed, it was unlikely my body would reach the delta at all. It was much more likely that one of the many water lizards of the vosque, or one of the great hooked bead turtles of the river, would seize my body and drag it and the frame under the water, destroying me in the mud below. There was also a chance that a wild tarn might swoop down and feed upon this helpless living morsel fastened to a degrading frame. Of one thing I was deeply certain: there would be no human assistance, nor pity, for the poor wretches upon the frames were none but villains, betrayers, and blasphemers against the priest-kings. It was a sacrilegious act even to consider terminating their sufferings. My wrists and ankles had already turned white and were quite numb. The oppressive, blinding glare of the sun, the heavy weight of its heat bore down upon me. My throat was already parched, and hanging only an inch or so above the vosque, I burned with thirst. Thoughts like probing needles vexed my brain. The image of that treacherous, beautiful Talina, in her dancing silks, as she had lain in my arms. It tormented me. She who would gladly give her kisses to that cold parkour for a place upon the throne of Ar. She whose implacable hatred had sent me to this terrible death, not even permitting me the honor of a warrior's end. I wanted to hate her. So much I wanted to hate her. But I found that I could not. I had come to love her. In the glade by the swamp forests, in the grain fields of the empire, upon the great highway of Ar, in that regal exotic caravan of Mintar, I had found the woman I loved. a scion of a barbaric race upon a remote and unknown world. Night came with infinite slowness, but at last the blinding sun was gone, and I welcomed the chill, windy darkness. The water lapped against the side of the frame. The stars sparkled above in frosty detachment. Once, to my horror, a scaled body crested under the frame, its glistening hide rubbing my body as it snapped its tail, and suddenly darted again beneath the water. It apparently was not carnivorous. Oddly enough, I cried out to the stars in joy, still clinging to life, unwilling to lament the fact that my miseries must now be prolonged. The sun swept into the sky once again, and my second day upon the vosque begun. I remember being afraid that I would never be able to use my hands and feet again, that they would never withstand the punishment of the ropes. But I laughed, remembering foolishly, like a madman, when I considered it wouldn't matter, that I would never have any further use of them. Perhaps it was my wild, almost demented laughter that attracted the Tarn. I saw him coming, making a silent strike with the sun upon his back, his talons extended like hooks. Savagely those vast talons struck and closed upon my body, forcing the frame for an instant beneath the water. Then the Tarn was once more beating the air angrily with his wings, struggling to lift his prey, and suddenly both myself and the heavy frame were pulled free from the water. The sudden weight of the frame swinging against my roped wrists and ankles, while the talons of the birds gripped my body, almost tore me apart. Then mercifully, the ropes, not meant to sustain the weight of that heavy frame, ripped and broke loose, and the Tarn triumphantly climbed skyward, still clutching me in his wild talons. I would have a few moments more of life, the same brief reprieve nature grants the mouse, carried by the hawk to its nest. Then on some barren crag my body would be torn to pieces by the beast whose prey I was. The Tarn, a brown Tarn, with a black crest, and the most wild Tarn, streak of that vague distant smudge I knew marked the escapements of some mountain wilderness. The vosque became a broad glimmering ribbon in the distance. Far below I could see that the burned dead margin of desolation was dotted here and there with patches of green, where some handfuls of seed had blindly asserted themselves, reclaiming some of that desolated country for life and growth. Near one of the green stretches, I saw what I first thought was a shadow, but as the Tarn passed, it scattered into a scampering flock of tiny creatures, probably the small three-toed mammals called qualle, dun-colored and with stiff bushy mane of black hair. As nearly as I could determine, we did not pass over or near the great highway that ran to the vosque. Had we done so, I might have seen the war horde of parkour on its way to R, with its marching columns, its lines of Thalarian riders, and its forging cavalries of townsmen, its supply wagons, its pack animals. And somewhere in that vast array, among the flags and booming of Tarn drums, would have been the girl who had betrayed me. As well as I could, I opened and closed my eyes, moving my feet, trying to restore in them some semblance of feeling. The flight of the Tarn was serene, and I, grateful to be free at last of the painful frame of humiliation, found myself, strangely enough, almost reconciled to the savage but swift fate I knew awaited me. But suddenly, the flight of the Tarn became more rapid, and in another minute, almost erratic and frenzied. He was fleeing. I tried to twist about in his claws, and my heart seemed to jerk spasmically in my breast. My hair froze as I heard the shrill, angry cry of another Tarn. He was an enormous creature, as sable as the helmet of parkour, his wings beating like whips, bearing down relentlessly upon my captor. My bird swerved dizzily, and the great assailant's talons passed harmlessly. Then he attacked again, and my bird once more swerved again, but the attacking Tarn had allowed for the maneuver, compensating for it for an instant before my own bird turned, with the result that it met my bird in full collision. I was conscious in that mad, terrible instant of the flash of steel-shod talons upon the breast of my bird, and then it shook as though seized with a convulsion, and opened its talons. With that I began to drop toward the waist below, and in that wild instant I saw the bird flapping, beginning to fall downward. I saw his attacker wheeling in my direction. Falling, I twisted madly, unsupported in the air, a wordless cry of anguish in my throat. I watched in horror as the ground seemed to rush upward to meet me, but I never reached it, for the attacking bird had swooped to intercept me, and seized me in his beak, much as one gull might seize a fish dropped by another. The beak, curved like an instrument of war, slit with its narrow nostrils, closed upon my body. I was once more the prize of a Tarn. Soon my swift captor had reached his mountain, and the vague distant smudge that I had seen had become a lonely, frightening, inaccessible wilderness of reddish cliffs. High on a sunlit mountain ledge, that sable Tarn dropped me to the sticks and brush of its nest, and set one steel-shod taloned foot across my body, to hold me steady as the great beak would do its work. As the beak reached for me, I managed to get one leg between it and my body, and I kicked it back, cursing. The sound of my voice had an unusual effect upon the bird. He tilted his head to one side quizzically. I shouted at him again and again, and then, fool that I was, half demented with hunger and terror, I only realized that the Tarn was none other than my own. I shoved upon the steel-shod foot that pressed me into the sticks of the nest, uttering my command with a ringing authority. The bird lifted its foot and backed away, still uncertain as what to do. I sprang to my feet, standing well within the reach of his beak, and I showed no fear. I slapped at his beak affectionately, as if we were on a Tarn cot. I then shoved my hands into his neck feathers, the area where the Tarns have trouble preening, and as the Tarn keepers do when searching for parasites. I withdrew some of the lice, the size of marbles, which tend to infest wild Tarns, and I slapped them roughly into the mouth of the Tarn, wiping them off upon his tongue. I did this again and again, and the Tarn stretched out his neck. The saddle and reins of the Tarn were no longer on the bird, and had undoubtedly rotted off or been rubbed from his back by scraping the rock encasement against its nest ledge. After a few minutes of my ministration, the Tarn, satisfied, and spread its wings, taking to flight, to continue the search for food, which had now been abrupted. Apparently, in his limited fashion, he no longer thought of me as being in the immediate category of the edible. That he might soon change his mind, particularly if we found nothing upon the plains below, was only too obvious. I cursed, because I had lost the Tarn goad in the quicksands of Oz Swamp. I examined the ledge for some means of escape, but the cliffs above and below were almost smooth. Suddenly a great shadow covered the ledge. My Tarn had removed. I looked up, and to my horror, saw that it was not my Tarn. It was another Tarn, a wild Tarn. He lit upon the ledge, snapping at his beak. This time I had none of that careful conditioning of the Tarn keepers working upon in my favor. I frantically looked about for a weapon, and then, hardly believing my eyes, I saw, woven roughly into the nest sticks, the remains of my harness and saddle. I seized my spear from the saddle sheath and turned. The beast had waited a moment too long. He had been too confident upon his trapped quarry, and as he stalked forward, oblivious of the spear, I hurled that broad-headed weapon deep into his breast. His legs gave way, and his body, wings outspread, sank to the granite flooring of the ledge. His head jerked, and eyes glassy. The body twitched and trembled uncontrollably, a cluster of spasmodic respectors. He had died the instant the spear had pierced his heart. I withdrew the weapon, and using it as a lever, rolled the twitching body to the brink of the ledge, and sent it flopping to the depths far below. I returned to the nest and salvaged what I could of the Tarn harness and saddle. There was the crossbow and longbow, there also their respective missiles. They were nowhere in evidence. The shield was also gone, but with the spear blade I cut into the locked saddle pack. It contained, as I knew it would, that homestone of Ar. It was unimpressive, small, flat, of a dull brown color. Carved upon it crudely was a single letter in the archaic Goran script. That single letter and the old spelling would have been the name of the city at the time the stone was carved. Ar, in all probability, had been one of dozens of inconspicuous villages upon the plains of Gor. Impatiently I set that stone aside. This pack also contained, and more importantly, the balance of my supplies, intended for the home flight to Korabar. The first thing I did was unseal one of the 2 water flasks and open the dried rations that were there upon the windy ledge. In the abode of the Tarn, I ate the meal that satisfied me as no ever had done before. Though it consisted only of some mouthfuls of warm water, a stale biscuit, and a wrapper of dried meat. I poked through the other contents of the saddle, delighted to find my old maps, and that device that served Koreans as both compass and chronometer, and as nearly as I could determine from map and memory, and of the location of the vosque, and the direction that I had been carried, I was somewhere in the Voltai Range, sometimes called the Red Mountains, south of the river and to the east of Ar. That would mean that I had unknowingly passed over the great highway, but whether ahead of or behind Parkour's horde, I had no true idea. My calculation as to my local tended to be confined by the dull brownish color of the reddish color of the cliffs, due to the presence of large deposits of iron oxide. I then took the binding fiver and an extra bowstring from the pack. I would use them in repairing the saddle and harness. I cursed myself for not having carried an extra Tarn goad somewhere in the saddle gear. Also, I should have carried an extra Tarn whistle. Mine had been lost when Talina had thrown me from the back of the Tarn, shortly after we had fled the walls of Ar. I wasn't sure I could control the Tarn without a Tarn goad. I had used it sparingly in my flights with him, even more sparingly than is even recommended, but it had always been there, ready to be used if needed. Now it was not there. Whether I could control the Tarn or not would probably, at least for a time, depend on whether or not he had been successful in his hunt, and how well the Tarn keepers had done their work with the young bird. It would also depend upon how deep the bite of freedom had been felt by that bird, how ready he would be to be controlled once more by man. With my spear I could kill him, but that would not rescue me from this ledge. I had no desire to die, eventually of starvation, in the lonely air of my tarn. I would leave upon his back or die. In the hours that remained before the return returned to his nest, I used the binding fiver and bowstrings to repair, as well as I could, the harness and saddle. By the time my great mount had settled again upon his ledge, I had finished my work, even to restoring the gear upon my saddle-pack. Almost as an afterthought, I included the homestone of Ar, that simple, uncomely piece of rock that had been so transformed my destiny and that of that empire. Gripped in the talons of the Tarn was the dead body of an antelope, one of the one-horned yellow antelopes called tubuks that frequent the bright colonna. The antelope's back had been broken, apparently within the Tarn's strike, and its neck and head lolled aimlessly to a side. When the Tarn had fed, I walked over to him, speaking familiarly, as if I might be doing the most customary thing upon Gor. I let him see the harness. I let him see it fully. And then slowly, with a measured care, I fastened it around his neck. I then threw the saddle over the bird's back, and crawled under his stomach to fasten the girth straps. Then calmly I climbed the newly repaired mounting ladder. I drew it up beside me, and I fashioned it to the side of the saddle. I sat still for a moment, and then decisively I drew back upon the one strap, and breathed a sweet sigh of relief as that black monster lifted himself up and into the night.